On March 14, 1989, at approximately 4:17 in the afternoon, a man of middle age entered a Walmart supercenter in Falls Church, Virginia, via its automatic doors, placidly propelling an empty shopping cart. His demeanor suggested someone merely stopping for groceries after finishing work. He was dressed in a beige windbreaker, khaki trousers, and wire-rimmed spectacles that reflected the fluorescent lights as he ambled past the seasonal display of Easter confectionaries. To all other patrons in the store that day, he was anonymous, unremarkable, just another individual in the throng of suburban shoppers navigating the broad aisles on a Wednesday afternoon. However, to the 12 FBI agents positioned throughout that Walmart, stealthily blended among genuine customers and disguised as store employees, this man represented the culmination of a 7-year counterintelligence operation. This mission had consumed thousands of investigative hours and spanned 3 presidential administrations. His name was Viktor Chernov, and for nearly a decade, he had operated as one of the most successful Soviet intelligence officers ever to infiltrate American soil. The narrative of Viktor Chernov's apprehension inside a discount retail store originates not in the suburban landscapes of Virginia, but rather within the classified briefing chambers of Langley and the clandestine realm of Cold War espionage that characterized the 1980s. Throughout that particular decade, American counterintelligence officials grew increasingly cognizant of an issue they struggled to precisely define: a persistent and severe outflow of sensitive information. This suggested the existence of a highly placed Soviet asset who possessed access to compartmentalized intelligence. Documents were vanishing from secure facilities, encrypted communications were being intercepted with alarming regularity, and agents operating in Eastern Europe were being systematically neutralized by KGB counterintelligence with disturbing frequency. The pattern was unequivocal to those trained to recognize it, yet the source remained frustratingly elusive. Viktor Chernov arrived in the United States in September 1982 under deep cover, meaning he entered not as an accredited Soviet diplomat with diplomatic immunity, but as an illegal, a spy without official protection and equipped with a thoroughly fabricated identity. According to the documentation he carried, he was Michael Vernon, a technical writer born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who had dedicated the preceding decade to working for various engineering firms across the Midwest. The legend, as intelligence agencies term these constructed identities, was almost flawless. The Soviets had painstakingly developed it over several years, establishing a paper trail that included tax returns, employment records, and even a marriage license from a brief union that concluded in divorce in 1978. The true Michael Vernon had perished in a car accident in 1973 at the age of 23, and Soviet intelligence had simply resurrected him, appropriately aging him and filling in the missing years with meticulously manufactured documentation. What rendered Chernov particularly formidable was not merely the impeccable quality of his cover, but also his operational patience and his profound comprehension of how American society truly functioned. Unlike some illegals who maintained suspicious isolation or displayed behavioral traits that marked them as foreign, Chernov meticulously integrated himself into the fabric of suburban American life. He leased a modest townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, joined a local Rotary Club, periodically volunteered at a community center, and held a low-profile position as a technical consultant for various defense contractors. He dated sporadically, but never seriously, cultivated friendships that were cordial but lacked intimacy, and generally presented himself as the quintessential middle-aged bachelor who had settled into a comfortable, albeit unremarkable, routine. Neighbors would later inform FBI investigators that he was pleasant, reserved, and helpful with tasks such as jump-starting cars or lending tools, but that upon reflection, they realized they knew almost nothing substantial about him. The technical consultant role was, naturally, the linchpin of his operation. Through a sequence of meticulously managed contracts with diverse firms in the defense and aerospace sectors, Chernov gained entry to facilities and personnel who handled classified information. He never sought access beyond his legitimate purviews, never exhibited undue interest in restricted materials, and never engaged in any activity that might trigger a security review. Instead, he meticulously cultivated relationships with individuals who possessed such access, transforming into the type of colleague who was easy to converse with over lunch, who grasped the technical intricacies of complex projects and who could be trusted with professional frustrations and workplace gossip. Through these relationships, through his own legitimate access to certain unclassified documents, and through what investigators would later characterize as an almost prodigious ability to synthesize intelligence from disparate fragments and peripheral sources, Chernov constructed an astonishingly complete understanding of American defense capabilities, nascent weapons systems, and counterintelligence operations. His tradecraft was exceptional. He utilized no communications equipment in his residence, maintained no suspicious contacts with Soviet officials, and never frequented the Soviet embassy or associated with known intelligence officers. Instead, he employed a system of dead drops, pre-arranged locations where he would deposit packages containing documents or microfilm to be retrieved by couriers who were entirely unaware they were serving as cutouts in an intelligence operation. These locations included a park bench in Georgetown, a hollow brick within a wall near a jogging trail, and a magnetic container affixed to the underframe of a specific park bench in Rock Creek Park. These sites would be serviced by individuals who believed they were assisting a friend in moving money or documents for entirely innocuous reasons, or sometimes by tourists and visiting academics who were themselves Soviet intelligence officers, but who never directly encountered Chernov. The system was elegant in its simplicity and impenetrable security. Even if one link were compromised, the chain would not lead back to him. The FBI's initial awareness of an individual fitting Chernov's description emerged from a defector in 1985, a mid-level KGB officer who, during his debriefing sessions, provided information concerning a highly productive illegal operating somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. The defector had never met this agent, nor did he know his name or specific location. However, he had seen intelligence reports attributed to an asset codenamed Prospect, Russian for avenue or prospect. The intelligence provided by Prospect was described as consistently high quality, technically detailed, and challenging to obtain, suggesting an individual with long-term access rather than a temporary visitor or someone who had executed a one-time theft. This was the initial thread, and it would take years to trace it back to its source. The investigation that would eventually be codenamed Operation Silent Thunder evolved into one of the most intense counterintelligence endeavors of the decade. FBI teams embarked on the meticulous process of analyzing every security breach, every missing document, and every classified program that appeared to have been compromised, searching for patterns that might indicate a single origin. They cross-referenced personnel with access, scrutinized financial anomalies, travel patterns, anything that might suggest an individual living beyond their means or maintaining suspicious contacts. The formidable challenge lay in the sheer volume of individuals with some level of security clearance within the Washington area. Tens of thousands of people held positions involving classified information, and the FBI was seeking someone who, by design, left almost no discernible trace. The breakthrough arrived from an unexpected quarter in late 1987. A Soviet intelligence officer named Valery Yenko, previously stationed at the United Nations in New York, who had defected and then, bizarrely, re-defected back to the Soviet Union, had, during his brief period in American custody, divulged a detail about the operational protocols employed by deep-cover illegals. He recounted how some of the most valuable assets were instructed to maintain what he termed normalization rituals, regular activities that were so quintessentially American, so utterly typical, that they would serve both as a cover and as a psychological anchor for officers who might otherwise begin to exhibit behavioral stress from the isolation and relentless deception inherent in their roles. These activities could range from bowling leagues to church attendance to shopping at specific stores at regular times. One of the FBI analysts working on the Prospect case, Catherine Reeves, who would later be awarded a CIA intelligence medal for her contributions, became particularly intrigued by this detail. She began examining patterns not in security breaches or classified access, but in the mundane routines of individuals who had some connection, however peripheral, to compromised information. She was looking for people who maintained regular patterns that seemed almost excessively regular, too deliberately normal. When she cross-referenced this approach with lists of technical consultants who had worked for multiple defense contractors over the preceding 5 years, a relatively small pool of names emerged. One of them was Michael Vernon. Vernon's background initially appeared robust. However, when investigators began to delve deeper into his history, subtle inconsistencies started to surface. A former employer from his purported work history in the 1970s had no record of him, despite tax documents indicating his employment there. A college transcript displayed grades in classes that had not been offered during that specific semester. A reference from a supervisor who, when finally located, had no recollection of him whatsoever. Each inconsistency was individually minor enough to be attributed to clerical error or faulty memory, but collectively, they suggested something more intentionally constructed. By early 1988, the FBI had placed Michael Vernon under surveillance. What they uncovered proved to be simultaneously captivating and disquieting. Vernon, whom they were progressively convinced was a Soviet operative performing illegal activities, maintained an exceptionally meticulous existence. He would attend his job, return home, occasionally dine out or see a film, visit a fitness center 3 times weekly, and every Sunday afternoon at 3 AUG, he would drive to the Walmart in Falls Church for his grocery shopping. These Sunday shopping excursions were so consistent that surveillance teams could precisely time their watches by them. He typically parked in roughly the same vicinity, entered the store, spent between 45 minutes and an hour procuring items, and then departed with several bags of groceries. He used cash for purchases, rarely engaged in conversation beyond brief pleasantries with cashiers, and consistently avoided drawing attention. For several months, the FBI observed and waited, meticulously constructing a detailed profile of his activities, documenting his contacts, and searching for the opportune moment when he would commit an act that would undeniably prove espionage. Their objective was to apprehend him in the process of gathering or transmitting classified intelligence, not merely to establish that he was living under a false identity. The legal threshold for a successful espionage prosecution necessitated tangible proof of actual intelligence operations, not merely suspicious conduct. Concurrently, counterintelligence officials grew increasingly concerned about the information Chernov might be acquiring and relaying to Moscow. The longer they delayed acting, the greater the potential harm he could inflict. However, if they acted prematurely without sufficient evidence, they risked losing him entirely, and with him, any prospect of comprehending the full scope of his operation. The FBI's strategy evolved into one of escalating pressure. They initiated a very careful, very subtle campaign to make Chernov aware he was under observation. A surveillance vehicle would become briefly visible in his rearview mirror for a slightly extended period. An agent would appear in the same restaurant where he was having lunch for 2 consecutive days. Nothing overtly conclusive, but sufficient for a trained intelligence officer to recognize the indicators. The intention was to unnerve him, to prompt him into making a mistake, into attempting to signal his handlers or accessing his emergency communication protocols. If they could apprehend him in the act of making contact with Soviet intelligence, their case would be solid. This pressure campaign persisted throughout the autumn of 1988 and into early 1989. Chernov's behavior began to exhibit signs of tension. He started varying his routes to work, dedicating more time to checking for surveillance, and becoming more circumspect in his interactions. Yet he did not violate protocol, did not attempt to contact the Soviet embassy, and did nothing that would furnish the FBI with the necessary evidence. Then, in March 1989, a shift occurred. One of the FBI's electronic surveillance teams, monitoring communications in a manner that would remain publicly undisclosed for many years, intercepted a fragment of a coded message that analysts believed was linked to the Prospect network. The message referenced a contingency meeting, an emergency protocol to be utilized only if an illegal operative faced imminent exposure. The time and location were embedded within the encrypted text. Following careful analysis, FBI cryptologists believed they had identified the location as somewhere within a commercial district of Falls Church, possibly a store or shopping center, on March 14th in the late afternoon. The decision to act on that date was made at the highest echelons of the FBI and CIA. If Chernov intended to attempt contact with his handlers or retrieve emergency documents and funds potentially hidden in a dead drop, this was the moment they would apprehend him. The question remained where exactly in Falls Church he would proceed. The FBI had teams prepared to cover multiple locations, But they were banking on one possibility that seemed most probable given Chernov's established routines. If he needed to perform an action in Falls Church that would provide cover, that wouldn't appear suspicious. Even if he was being followed, there was one place he went regularly, predictably every week: the Walmart. March 14, 1989, was a Wednesday, not Chernov's usual Sunday shopping day, which lent further credibility to the FBI's theory that something out of the ordinary was occurring. Surveillance teams picked him up as he departed his townhouse at 3:45 p.m., earlier than his customary shopping time, and followed him as he drove directly to the Falls Church Walmart. FBI agents were already strategically positioned throughout the store. Some were disguised as customers pushing carts and perusing aisles. Others were in the back room coordinating with store management, who had been briefed on the operation just hours prior. One agent had been stationed at the photo development counter, another at the customer service desk. Two were positioned in the parking lot, observing the entrance. The plan was to observe, to wait for Chernov to execute whatever task he had come to accomplish, and then to intercept him before he could leave. Chernov entered the store at 4:17, and for the initial 20 minutes, he appeared to be shopping normally. He selected a carton of milk, some bread, and several cans of soup. He navigated the aisles with the same unhurried pace he always displayed. However, FBI agents who had been observing him for months noticed subtle deviations in his behavior. He was more vigilant than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the store. He paused at the end of aisles as if checking for surveillance. Near the rear of the store, in the section selling automotive supplies and hardware, he stopped at a display of motor oil, picked up a container, examined it, and then replaced it. He repeated this action several times, his movements deliberate and specific. The watching agents realized what was happening. This was counter-surveillance behavior, a method of assessing his surroundings while appearing to be engaged in a normal shopping activity. After several minutes near the automotive section, Chernov pushed his cart toward the rear of the store, in the direction of the restrooms. He left his cart near a display of paper towels and entered the men's restroom. This was the moment the FBI had been anticipating. Two agents immediately moved to positions near the restroom entrance, while others fanned out to block potential exits. Inside the restroom, Chernov went directly to the third stall from the door, the one farthest from the entrance. He entered it, locked the door, and for nearly 3 minutes, there was silence. What transpired during those 3 minutes was later reconstructed from physical evidence and Chernov's subsequent confession. Behind the toilet in that stall, there was a removable panel that provided access to the plumbing. It had been subtly modified, imperceptibly to anyone not actively searching for it, to create a small hollow space. Inside that space was a waterproof container. And inside that container was a different life. A Canadian passport under a different name, $5,000 in cash, a set of contact protocols for emergency exfiltration, and a list of dead drops and safe houses that stretched from Virginia to the Canadian border. This was Chernov's escape kit, placed there months earlier through methods the FBI never fully determined. It was intended to be accessed only in a situation where his cover was completely compromised and he needed to flee. When Chernov emerged from the restroom, he was carrying the waterproof container in a plastic Walmart bag he had taken from a rack near the entrance. He had placed it among the other items in his shopping cart, attempting to make it appear as just another purchase. He pushed the cart back through the store, now moving more swiftly than before, his demeanor noticeably altered. The casual suburban shopper was gone, replaced by someone who understood he was running out of time. He abandoned the cart near the checkout lanes and began walking rapidly toward the exit, carrying only the plastic bag. He made it approximately 30 feet from the automatic doors before FBI Special Agent Thomas Brennan stepped in front of him and stated, "Michael Vernon, or whoever you are, FBI, you need to come with us." Chernov halted immediately, and for just a moment, witnesses would later recount, he looked almost relieved. He offered no resistance, made no attempt to flee, and did not reach for anything that might have been a weapon or a suicide device. He simply said, "I want to speak to an attorney," and allowed himself to be handcuffed. The arrest occurred in front of approximately 15 astonished Walmart customers who were oblivious to the fact that they had just witnessed the conclusion of one of the most significant counterintelligence operations of the Cold War. The apprehension of Viktor Chernov, whose true identity was confirmed through fingerprint analysis conducted by the FBI and cross-referenced with Soviet intelligence records later obtained through liaison services, represented both a triumph and a frustration for American counterintelligence. The triumph was self-evident. A deep-cover illegal operative had been caught in the act of attempting to utilize his escape protocols, providing clear evidence of his espionage activities. The frustration was equally apparent. While they had apprehended Chernov, they had not caught him in the act of transmitting classified information, which meant constructing a comprehensive case about precisely what he had stolen, and the extent of the damage he had caused would prove extraordinarily challenging. Chernov himself was uncooperative. After his initial statement requesting an attorney, he had said virtually nothing. What ensued was a complex legal and diplomatic maneuver that would largely unfold out of public scrutiny. The Reagan administration was in its final year, soon to transition to George H.W. Bush, and the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was experiencing a period of cautious thaw. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were altering the dynamics of Cold War tensions. Though espionage undeniably persisted, both sides increasingly recognized that specific conflicts could be resolved through negotiation rather than escalation. The apprehension of a Soviet illegal on American soil presented precisely the kind of incident that could either be exploited for propaganda purposes or quietly settled via the intelligence channels that linked Washington and Moscow, even at the peak of the Cold War. Within weeks of Chernov's arrest, Soviet officials initiated carefully phrased inquiries through clandestine channels regarding a potential swap. They did not admit that Chernov was one of their own. Officially, they maintained complete ignorance of Viktor Chernov's identity, asserting that the individual arrested in Falls Church was merely Michael Vernon, an American citizen falsely accused. However, through intelligence liaison, diplomatic contacts, and the discreet conversations between professionals who comprehended the mechanics of the game, a different message was relayed. If the United States desired the return of someone currently in Soviet custody, arrangements might be feasible. The United States indeed sought the return of an individual, although the specifics of this person's identity remain classified to this day. What is known, and what has been corroborated by declassified documents and diligent reporting by journalists covering the intelligence community, is that an American intelligence officer had been arrested in Eastern Europe in 1986 and was being held in a Soviet facility on charges of espionage. This officer, whose name has never been publicly disclosed and whose family has been shielded by a classification veil that extends even to their gender, had been engaged in a particularly sensitive operation that was compromised through unclear means. For 3 years, the CIA and State Department had endeavored to secure this officer's release, but the Soviets had shown no interest in negotiation until Chernov's arrest. The negotiations were conducted via intelligence channels rather than diplomatic ones, a common practice in spy exchanges. The FBI had an interest in prosecuting Chernov, bringing him to trial, and exposing the extent of his operations, both as a deterrent to other Soviet illegals and as a means of understanding the compromised information. However, the CIA had an overriding interest in retrieving its officer, an individual trained at immense cost, who had risked their life for American intelligence interests, and who was enduring deteriorating conditions of imprisonment. The ultimate decision regarding which interest would prevail rested with the White House, and the outcome favored making the trade. The negotiations spanned several months. Both parties needed to confirm that the individuals they would receive were authentically who they purported to be, were in acceptable health, and that the exchange could proceed without either side gaining a tactical advantage. Discussions encompassed locations, timing, and who would be present. The Soviets initially suggested conducting the exchange at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, the renowned crossing point between East and West used for prior spy swaps. But American negotiators advocated for an alternative location, one less symbolic and less prone to attracting media attention. Ultimately, they agreed upon a location in Vienna, Austria, a neutral city where both American and Soviet intelligence services maintained substantial presences, and where such exchanges could be executed with a degree of discretion. On October 7, 1989, less than a month before the fall of the Berlin Wall would irrevocably alter the landscape of the Cold War, Viktor Chernov was removed from the federal detention facility where he had been held since his arrest and transported to Andrews Air Force Base. He was flown under heavy guard to Austria on a military aircraft. The American intelligence officer, whose identity remains classified, was brought from Soviet custody to the same location through similar arrangements. The actual exchange occurred in a hotel conference room in Vienna, a deliberately unremarkable setting chosen specifically to circumvent the drama and publicity of earlier Cold War spy swaps. According to the limited information released, the exchange itself was brief and professional. Chernov and the American officer were escorted into the room from opposite doorways, each accompanied by representatives of their respective intelligence services. A moment of verification ensued, during which officials from each side confirmed the identity of the person they were receiving. Then, with minimal ceremony, the two walked past each other, moving from one set of handlers to the other. Chernov was received by Soviet officials who promptly escorted him from the hotel to a waiting aircraft. The American officer was received by CIA officials who did likewise. The entire exchange concluded in less than 15 minutes. Viktor Chernov returned to the Soviet Union, and for a period, that seemed to be the conclusion of his narrative. He was welcomed as a returning hero by the KGB, assigned what was described as a comfortable position in Moscow, and effectively vanished from Western intelligence awareness. However, the Soviet Union itself was in its twilight years. Upon the USSR's collapse in 1991, a significant volume of information concerning Cold War intelligence operations began to leak through various channels, including KGB officers who found themselves suddenly unemployed and willing to converse with Western journalists and intelligence agencies for the appropriate price. Through these sources, a more comprehensive picture of Chernov's operations started to emerge. According to intelligence provided by former KGB officers, and subsequently partially corroborated by documents released by Russian intelligence services seeking to display their Cold War successes, Viktor Chernov, operating as Michael Vernon, had during his 7 years in the United States successfully identified and reported on over 40 classified American defense and intelligence programs. He had furnished detailed information on electronic warfare systems undergoing development for the Air Force, on satellite reconnaissance capabilities, on counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet diplomatic personnel, and on at least 3 notable technological advancements that the Soviet military utilized to adapt their own systems. The intelligence he supplied was characterized by one former KGB officer in an interview with a Western journalist as being equivalent to what might be obtained by having access to a highly placed mole in multiple defense agencies simultaneously. Even though Chernov himself never possessed that level of access, his brilliance lay in aggregation, in compiling fragments of information from dozens of disparate sources and assembling them into a holistic overview. The question of the extent of damage Chernov actually inflicted upon American national security remains a subject of ongoing debate among intelligence historians. The CIA has never fully declassified its damage assessment and likely never will, as doing so would necessitate revealing precisely which secrets were compromised and how they were obtained. Former intelligence officials who have spoken on the record, typically years after their retirement, have suggested that while Chernov was certainly successful by the standards of Soviet intelligence operations, the information he provided did not fundamentally alter the balance of the Cold War. The United States preserved its technological and intelligence advantages, and the programs he compromised were either adapted or, in some instances, were already understood to be vulnerable. However, other analysts have contended that this assessment undervalues the cumulative impact of his reporting, arguing that having detailed information on American capabilities allowed Soviet military planners to make decisions and allocate resources they otherwise would not have, and that this carried strategic implications that may not have been immediately obvious. What is evident is that the FBI's operation to identify and apprehend Chernov was regarded as a significant achievement within the counterintelligence community. It demonstrated that even the most meticulously constructed illegal identity could be penetrated through patient analysis and the application of appropriate investigative techniques. The fact that he was caught in a Walmart, of all places, became something of a legend within the FBI. a story recounted to new counterintelligence agents as an illustration of how real-world espionage was often far more prosaic than its portrayal in films and novels. There was no car chase, no shootout, no dramatic confrontation at a picturesque location. Just a middle-aged man in a suburban discount store attempting to retrieve his escape kit from behind a toilet, being arrested by agents who had observed him shopping for groceries every Sunday for months. The American intelligence officer who was exchanged for Chernov returned to the United States and was reportedly extensively debriefed about their period in Soviet custody and about the operation that led to their capture. Beyond that, almost nothing is publicly known. The CIA has maintained this person's identity as classified under what is termed a permanent cover status, meaning that even decades later, their name, their assignment, and the circumstances of their arrest remain protected. Families of CIA officers who went missing or were captured during the Cold War have occasionally speculated that their loved one might have been the individual traded for Chernov. However, the agency has never confirmed or denied any of these theories. What is understood is that this individual survived, was repatriated, and managed to rebuild some semblance of a life after years of incarceration, which, under the circumstances, constitutes its own form of triumph. The Walmart store continues to operate presently, although it has undergone multiple renovations and expansions since 1989. The restroom where he retrieved his escape apparatus has been refurbished. The panel behind the toilet has been replaced, and there is no trace to suggest that anything out of the ordinary ever occurred there. The FBI does not commemorate the locations of its operations with plaques or historical markers. Consequently, the site of one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the Cold War is now merely another American retail space frequented by individuals who are entirely unaware of the history beneath their feet. This anonymity is perfectly fitting for an operation that, from its inception to its conclusion, revolved around the concealed nature of intelligence work and the fact that the most pivotal events in the clandestine conflict between superpowers frequently unfolded in the most mundane settings. In the years following 1989, the narrative of Viktor Chernov has become one of those Cold War espionage cases primarily discussed within the intelligence community and among historians who specialize in that period. It has not attained the widespread public recognition of cases such as Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen. Perhaps this is because Chernov was not an American who betrayed his nation, but a Soviet officer who, by the standards of his service, performed his duties commendably. There is an element in the American perception of espionage that finds traitors more compelling than foreign spies, possibly because betrayal leaves a deeper wound than mere opposition. However, within the FBI and CIA, in the offices where counterintelligence officers continue their efforts to identify foreign intelligence operations on American soil, the Chernov case is remembered as an illustration of what patient, systematic investigation can achieve, even against an adversary trained to be undetectable. The disintegration of the Soviet Union 2 years after Chernov's apprehension and the conclusion of the Cold War transformed the character of these operations, but it did not eliminate them. Russian intelligence services and those of many other nations persist in deploying illegals in the United States. These are officers with deeply ingrained false identities who live seemingly ordinary lives while gathering information regarding American capabilities and intentions. The methodologies have advanced, the technologies have evolved, but the fundamental essence of the work remains unaltered. And somewhere within the FBI's counterintelligence division, analysts are still scrutinizing patterns, still endeavoring to pinpoint those subtle inconsistencies in an individual's background that might indicate a fabricated identity, still observing people grocery shopping and contemplating who they truly are. Viktor Chernov himself, subsequent to his return to the Soviet Union and the subsequent collapse of that state, largely receded from public view. There have been sporadic reports over the years from journalists who claim to have located him living unobtrusively in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but none of these accounts have been definitively corroborated. If he's still alive, he would be in his 80s now. An elderly man carrying recollections of a world that no longer exists, of a time when the stakes felt existential, and when the work he performed seemed significant in the grand sweep of history, whether he reflects on his time as Michael Vernon with pride or regret, whether he considers his arrest in that Walmart and wonders if he made some error that exposed him, These are inquiries that only he can answer, and he has chosen not to speak publicly about any of it. What endures is the story itself, a narrative that encapsulates something fundamental about the nature of espionage during the Cold War. It was not, for the most part, the glamorous, action-packed adventure portrayed in popular culture. It was patient, systematic, often laborious work carried out by individuals who understood that success was gauged in small increments, in information meticulously gathered piece by piece, in identities maintained year after year without faltering. Viktor Chernov excelled at this work, perhaps exceptionally so, and he might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a defector's fragmented intelligence, an analyst's insight into normalization rituals, and the slow, steady accumulation of evidence that ultimately guided the FBI to a townhouse in Arlington and a shopping routine in Falls Church. In the final analysis, 7 years of meticulous work culminated in 3 minutes in a bathroom stall and 30 feet between that stall and the Walmart exit, a distance he did not quite traverse before his particular conflict came to an end.